Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The carriage wheels screamed against the gravel. Each turn was a protest, a final, grinding plea before the end. I felt the sound in my teeth, in the hollow space behind my ribs where my heart used to beat. Now, it just trembled. A trapped bird against a cage of bone. Outside, the forest was a wall of black pine and shadow. The air tasted of frost and something ancient, something that owned the very stones of the road. This was his scent, the scent of the Blackwood territory. It smelled like an ending. The carriage lurched to a stop. For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy pant of the horses and the frantic thrumming in my own veins. My stepfather, Ronan, cleared his throat beside me. A wet, nervous sound. He refused to look at me. He hadn't looked at me for the entire 3-day journey. It was easier to sell something you pretended wasn't there. "Stay still," he muttered, his hand gripping the door handle. "Don't speak unless you're spoken to. Don't look him in the eye. He doesn't like defiance." I said nothing. My voice had been stolen from me long ago, first by fear, then by habit. Silence was my only shield. And now, it was part of the price. The iron gates groaned open. The sound echoed across the courtyard, a low, guttural welcome from a beast of metal and stone. Guards lined the path to the keep, their faces carved from granite, their eyes holding the flat, cold light of the winter sky. They didn't watch us. They watched me. A piece of meat tossed into a den of wolves, a tribute, a sacrifice to appease a king. Ronan's hand clamped around my upper arm, his fingers digging in like claws. He hauled me from the carriage, my worn boots stumbling on the unfamiliar ground. The air was colder here, sharper. It sliced at the thin fabric of my dress, raising gooseflesh on my skin. I kept my eyes down, focused on the dark, wet stones under my feet. One step, then another. This was the walk of the condemned. The great hall was a cavern of silence and cold. Banners depicting a snarling black wolf hung from rafters lost in shadow, stirring faintly in a draught I couldn't feel. A fire pit in the center was dark, the ashes as gray and lifeless as my hopes. And at the far end of the hall, on a throne of polished obsidian and dark wood, he sat, the Alpha King, Melon Rook. I felt his presence before I saw him. It was a weight in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, the kind of power that didn't need to be announced. It simply was. Ronan pushed me forward, forcing me to my knees a dozen feet from the dais. The stone was ice-cold through my dress, seeping into my bones. "Alpha King," Ronan said, his voice straining to sound strong, but it cracked like thin ice. "As agreed, I bring the offering. My stepdaughter Raya, to seal the pact between our packs. A bride for the king, a promise of peace." The silence that followed was a living thing. It stretched, it coiled, it waited. I dared to lift my gaze, just for a second. Past the heavy boots, the dark trousers, to the man on the throne. He was older, as the whispers had claimed. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples. His face was a map of hard lines and old battles. A jagged scar ran from his brow, across the bridge of his nose, and disappeared into the collar of his tunic. But it was his eyes that stole the air from my lungs. They were gold. A deep, molten gold, like a wolf's, but they held no warmth, only a chilling, ancient stillness. He looked down at me, and I felt assessed, weighed, measured, like a horse at market. "She is small," the king's voice rumbled. It wasn't loud, but it filled every inch of the vast hall. A sound of gravel and winter wind. Ronan's grip on my shoulder tightened painfully. "She is strong, my lord. Healthy. She will serve you well." "Serve you?" The words hung in the air, stripped of all pretense. This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction. My life for my pack's safety, my future for Ronan's ambition. The king's gaze swept over me once more, lingering on the worn hem of my dress, the cheap leather of my boots. A flicker of something disdain, perhaps crossed his face before it was gone. He was not impressed with his purchase. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his throne. The movement was fluid, powerful, the grace of a predator. He descended the 3 short steps of the dais, his boots making no sound on the stone. He stopped just before me, close enough that I could smell him. Pine needles, cold air, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like blood and ozone after a lightning strike. He was immense, a wall of muscle and dominance that blotted out the world. A finger, calloused and cold, came to rest under my chin. He forced my head up, his touch impersonal, commanding. I had no choice but to meet his gaze. Up close, his eyes were even more terrifying. They were ancient, knowing, and utterly devoid of emotion. He saw everything, the fear trembling through my limbs, the defiance I tried to hide in the clench of my jaw, the hollowness behind my eyes. He saw it all, and he did not care. "Leave her," he said, his golden eyes still locked on mine. The command was not directed at me. I heard his sharp intake of breath, a rustle of cloth as he bowed hastily. "Yes, Alpha King. Of course." I heard his footsteps retreating, quick, eager to be gone. The sound echoed, growing fainter and fainter, until it was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He was gone. My last link to the life I knew was gone. Sold and delivered. The king's finger left my chin, but the chill of his touch remained. He turned his back on me and walked back to his throne. "Kian," he said, his voice resonating from the stone around me. A shadow detached itself from the wall. A tall, lean wolf with a severe face and eyes the color of slate stepped forward. His beta. He bowed his head. "Alpha, take her to the North Tower. See that she is bathed and fed." The king settled back onto his throne, picking up a goblet from a small table beside it. He looked at the wine, not at me. I was already forgotten. A piece of property, delivered and stored. "She is not to leave the room," he added, his voice dropping, taking on an edge of steel. "For any reason." The command was a blade, sharp and final. The beta, Kian, gestured for me to rise. My knees ached from the cold stone, and my legs felt weak, unsteady. I pushed myself up, my hands flat on the floor for support. I didn't look at the king again. I couldn't. I followed the beta out of the great hall, my footsteps a small, lonely echo behind his confident stride. We climbed endless flights of spiraling stone stairs, the air growing colder with each level. The tapestries on the walls were faded, depicting brutal hunts and forgotten wars. This castle wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a tomb. The room was at the very top of the tower. It was large and circular, with a canopied bed, a hearth where a small fire already crackled, and a heavy oak wardrobe. There were 2 windows, tall and narrow like an archer's slits, looking out over the dark expanse of the forest. It was more luxurious than any room I had ever known, and it was unequivocally a cage. Kian stopped at the door. "There is a bath through there," he said, nodding towards a smaller door. "Food will be brought. Do not try the main door. It will be locked from the outside." His gaze was as cold and unfeeling as his master's. He looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture he'd just delivered. Then he was gone. The heavy sound of a bolt sliding home echoed through the room. The sound of my new life beginning. I walked to one of the narrow windows, my breath fogging the thick, wavy glass. The forest stretched out into an ocean of darkness, under a sky with no moon. I was alone. Utterly and completely alone. Trapped in the tower of a scarred king who looked at me with eyes of dead gold. Ronan had sold me for peace, but the king had not bought a bride. He had bought my silence, and he had locked it away in a tower where no one would ever hear it again. The silence in the tower was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, weighted with the dust of ages, with the cold of the stone, with the sheer, crushing presence of the fortress around me. I could feel the castle breathing, a slow, deep rhythm that had nothing to do with life and everything to do with power. I was a ghost in its lungs. I ran my hand along the wall. The stone was smooth, worn by time and countless other hands, but it offered no warmth. The fire in the hearth crackled, a small, defiant sound, but its heat didn't reach the corners of the room. It couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep inside me. I was a prisoner. The word was simple, but the reality of it was a physical thing, a knot in my stomach, a tightness in my chest. The door was oak, bound with iron straps. The lock was a testament to its purpose. There was no escape. Hours passed. The sky outside the narrow windows bled from gray to a deep, bruised purple. A servant, an older woman with a face like a knotted root and weary eyes, brought a tray. She set it on a small table by the fire, her movements practiced and silent. She didn't look at me. Not once. She laid out a simple meal, thick bread, cheese, a cup of watered wine, and left, the bolt sliding home behind her with a deafening finality. I didn't eat. Hunger was a distant memory, a feeling that belonged to a girl who still had a future. I crawled into the large canopied bed. The sheets were clean and smelled faintly of lavender, a scent so out of place in this brutal fortress that it made my throat ache. I curled into a tight ball, pulling the heavy furs over me, seeking a warmth that wasn't there. I expected to lie awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the lonely howl of the wind. But sleep took me quickly, a sudden, deep plunge into blackness. And then, there was the scent. Rain on dry earth, crushed pine needles, the clean, sharp smell of a forest after a storm. It wasn't a memory. It was real. I could feel cool, damp air on my skin. I could hear the gentle crackle of a fire. I was no longer in the tower. I stood in a clearing surrounded by ancient towering pines. A small, bright fire danced in the center, casting a warm, flickering glow. The moon was a silver coin hanging in the black velvet sky. I felt calm. The fear that had been my constant companion for weeks was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet peace. I was not alone. He was there, on the other side of the fire. A silhouette, at first. A presence more felt than seen. A great, dark wolf. His shoulders powerful, his head low. But his eyes, they burned in the darkness. Gold. Not the cold, dead gold of the king's eyes. This was living gold. The color of honey in the sun, of autumn, leaves, of flame. They held an impossible warmth, a deep and aching familiarity. I wasn't afraid. My wolf, the one I'd never had, the one I was told I was born without, stirred within me. A faint, dormant thing, it uncurled and reached for him. A call and an answer. The wolf took a step forward, into the firelight. The shadows shifted, and he was no longer a wolf. He was a man, young, tall and leanly muscled, with dark hair that fell across his brow. I couldn't see his face clearly. It was always just at the edge of the light, half hidden in shadow, but I didn't need to. I knew him, in my bones, in my blood. "Little bird," a voice whispered, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. The voice was deep, gentle, and it vibrated through me like a forgotten song. "You're safe here." I tried to speak, to ask his name, to ask where we were, but my voice was gone here too. He seemed to understand. He smiled, a faint, sad curve of his lips in the shadows. "It's all right. You don't have to speak. I can hear you." He took another step, and the firelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the column of his throat. He was real, more real than the cold stone of my prison. "They call you Raya," he said, his mental voice soft. "But that's not your true name, is it? Not the one the moon gave you." My heart stumbled. No one knew that name. My mother had whispered it to me only once, on the night she died, her hand cool on my feverish brow. A secret name, a soul name, Lyra. The name settled over me like a warm cloak. Hearing it from him felt like coming home. Tears pricked my eyes. How could he know? "Fate doesn't forget," he answered my unspoken question. He sat on a fallen log near the fire, his golden eyes never leaving mine. They held a universe of sorrow, of longing. And neither do I. "I've been waiting for you." The dream felt like an eternity and a single heartbeat. We didn't speak of kings or prisons. He spoke of the stars, of the feel of the wind when you run, of the scent of the first snow. He spoke of a life I'd only ever imagined, a life of freedom. I woke with a gasp, my hand reaching for something that wasn't there. The tower room was dark and cold. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The scent of pine and rain was gone, replaced by the smell of dust and despair. But the feeling, the warmth of his presence, the echo of his voice in my soul, it lingered. It wasn't just a dream. I knew it. It was something more. A memory, a promise. The days that followed fell into a numb routine. The silent servant would come and go. I would eat a few bites of bread, drink some water. I would stand at the window for hours, staring at the endless, unforgiving sea of trees. I was a bird in a gilded cage, well-fed, well-kept, and slowly dying inside. Every night, I escaped. Every night, I returned to the clearing, to him, Eamon. He finally gave me his name, a whisper against the landscape of my mind. We never touched. We never moved from our opposite sides of the fire. But the bond between us grew, a living thread of light in my dark world. He was my hope, my secret, my sanity. But with each visit, the sorrow in his golden eyes seemed to grow deeper. "I'm sorry," he would murmur, looking into the flames. "I'm so sorry, Lyra. This isn't how it was supposed to be." He never explained. He never told me where he was, or why we could only meet in this dream space. He was a beautiful, painful mystery, a ghost with golden eyes. One night, a week into my captivity, I was jolted awake by a sound, not from the dream, from the real world, a howl. It rose from somewhere deep within the castle, from the very foundations of the stone beneath me. It was not the proud call of an alpha to his pack. It was a sound of pure, undiluted agony, a long, mournful cry of a soul being torn apart. It was filled with such loss, such despair, that it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. My own heart clenched in a vice of sympathetic pain. The howl faded into a shuddering whimper, and then silence. A silence that was now filled with a terrible question. The next evening, the heavy bolt on my door slid back long before the servant was due. My breath caught. I stood from the window seat, my hands clenched at my sides. King Malin filled the doorway. His presence was like a storm front, sucking all the air and warmth from the room. He stepped inside, his dark tunic and leather breeches making him seem like a creature carved from the night itself. His scarred face was impassive, his expression unreadable. He walked past me, his gaze sweeping the room. An inspection. He was checking on his property. He stopped by the hearth, nudging a log with the toe of his boot, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "You have been quiet," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an observation of a well-behaved possession. I didn't answer. I just stood there, my pulse a frantic drum against my ribs, waiting. He turned slowly, his powerful form eclipsing the low firelight. His cold gaze found mine and held it. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of emotion, just the flat, possessive stare of a king looking at a tribute. "You will remain so," he continued, his voice a low rumble of command. "Your pack is safe, so long as you remember your place. You belong to me now." He took a step closer. The scent of him pine, cold air, old blood filled my senses, choking me. I forced myself to stand my ground, to not flinch away. I lifted my chin, my one small act of defiance, and I looked him square in the eye. My breath hitched, my world tilted on its axis. They were the same. The cold, dead gold of the king staring down at me, and the warm, sorrowful gold of the man in my dreams. They were the exact same shade, the exact same shape. The king who owned my body, and the ghost who held my soul, had the same impossible golden eyes. The realization was a shard of ice in my gut. Golden eyes, the king in front of me, a monolith of cold power and possession. The man in my dreams, a gentle soul full of warmth and sorrow. It was impossible. A cruel trick of the mind. A desperate, foolish hope. They couldn't be the same. One was my captor, the other my sanctuary. Malin's gaze narrowed. A flicker of something annoyance? Curiosity? Passed through those chilling depths. He saw the shock on my face, the sudden, sharp intake of my breath. "You have something to say?" he rumbled, his voice laced with a dangerous patience. I shook my head, my throat closing up. I dropped my gaze back to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't look. Don't let him see. Don't let him know he shares the face of your only escape." He watched me for a moment longer, the silence stretching into a razor's edge. I could feel his stare on the top of my head, a physical weight. Then, with a low sound of dismissal, he turned and left. The bolt slammed home, and the echo of his footsteps faded down the stone stairs. I collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. The man in my dreams, Eamon, he was gentle. His spirit was a warm fire. The king was a glacier, a walking winter. Their scent was different. Their presence was different. Everything was different, except for their eyes. The nightly dream became a desperate search for answers. When I closed my eyes, the tower melted away, and I was back in the moonlit clearing. The fire crackled. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Eamon was there, waiting. He looked tired. There were new lines of strain around his mouth, a deeper sorrow in his golden eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, my silent voice filled with a new urgency. He shook his head, looking away from me, into the dancing flames. "It's nothing, Lyra. Don't worry about it." I heard a howl. I pushed, the memory of that soul-tearing sound still fresh. Last night, a wolf in pain. His shoulders tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. The fire popped, spitting an ember onto the dark earth. "It was my brother," he finally whispered, his voice laced with a pain so profound it felt like my own. "Brother?" The word hit me like a physical blow. "The king. He was talking about the king. He's in pain?" The question felt absurd. Malin was made of stone and ice. He didn't feel pain. He caused it. Eamon's laugh was a bitter, broken sound. Pain is all he knows. He has been in a cage of his own making for a long time. He finally looked at me, his golden eyes pleading for me to understand something I couldn't possibly grasp. "He's not what you think he is. He is my jailer," I shot back, the anger and fear from my waking life bleeding into the dream. "He bought me like cattle. He bought you to protect you," Eamon countered, his voice sharp with a sudden, fierce intensity. "Ronan was going to sell you to the Jarl of the Northern Wastes, a man who collects pretty things until they break." Mullen intervened. "He paid a bride price he couldn't afford and brought you here to keep you safe." The world tilted again. Safe? In this tower? A prisoner? It made no sense. This was a brutal king, feared by all. Why would he save a nameless Omega from a rival pack? Why? Eamon's gaze softened, the sorrow returning. Because of a promise he made a long time ago. A promise to our mother. He sighed, a sound of old, weary grief. He is bound by an oath he cannot break, and it is destroying him. He wouldn't say more. He turned the conversation back to the stars, to the scent of the coming snow. But the dream was fractured. The image of the cold, cruel king was now blurred, tainted by the impossible idea of his sacrifice. The ghost of his pain, as described by Eamon, now haunted my waking hours. The whispers started a few days later. It was the serving woman, the one with the face like a knotted root. She was laying out my meal, her movements as silent and practiced as ever. But this time, as she turned to leave, she hesitated. Her gaze flickered to me for a barest second, her lips moving without sound. "The prince," she mouthed, her eyes wide with a fear that was not for herself, but for me. Then she was gone, the bolt sliding home. The prince, Eamon. He was a prince, which meant Malin, the king, was his brother. The ghost in my dreams was real. He was somewhere in this castle, and the staff was afraid for me to know it. The howl came again a few nights later, that same gut-wrenching cry of pure agony rising from the stones below. This time, I didn't cower. I ran to the door, pressing my ear against the thick, cold oak. I could hear nothing but the whistle of the wind through the tower stones. But the sound, it was closer this time. It wasn't coming from outside the castle. It was coming from within. From below. My prison became a map I needed to solve. I started paying attention to every detail. The way the light fell through the narrow windows at different times of day. The faint, echoing sounds that traveled up the spiraling staircase. The scent of damp stone that was sometimes stronger than others, always seeming to come from the floor beneath my feet. The tower wasn't just a tower. It was built on something else. Something older. My chance came unexpectedly. A storm rolled in from the northern mountains, a howling beast of wind and sleet. The castle groaned under the assault. That night, the serving woman was late. When she finally arrived, her face was pale, her hands trembling. "The lower passages are flooding," she muttered, more to herself than to me, as she set down my tray. "Guards are all down there, trying to shore up the old walls." She left in a hurry, and in her haste, she didn't shoot the bolt with its usual deafening finality. There was a faint click, but not the heavy thud I was used to. My heart stopped. I waited, counting the seconds, my breath held tight in my chest. 1 minute, 2, 5. Silence. With shaking hands, I pushed on the heavy oak door. It swung inward with a low groan. Freedom, or at least the illusion of it. The corridor outside was empty, lit by a single flickering torch that cast long, dancing shadows. The main staircase spiraled down into darkness, but that wasn't where I was going. My instincts, my very soul, pulled me in the other direction, toward a small, unremarkable door at the far end of the hall I had never noticed before. It was a service entrance, leading to a much narrower, steeper set of stairs. The air that rose from it was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sad, the scent of old blood and forgotten things. I followed it down. The stairs were treacherous, slick with moisture. They wound down, and down, and down, far deeper than I thought the castle went. The grand tapestries and polished stone of the upper levels gave way to rough-hewn rock and dripping walls. This was the fortress's underbelly, its ancient, secret heart. The howling I'd heard, it came from here. I could feel it in the stones, a lingering vibration of sorrow. The stairs ended in a dark, narrow passage. A faint, golden light flickered from around a corner at the far end. I moved toward it, my bare feet silent on the cold, gritty floor. My heart was a frantic drum, a mix of terror and a strange, undeniable pull. The scent of Aemon from my dreams, rain and pine, was here, faint, but growing stronger with every step. He was here. I rounded the corner and froze. It was a cell. The passage opened into a small, dungeon-like space. The light came from a single torch set in a rusted bracket on the wall. The front of the cell was a wall of thick, iron bars, and inside, chained to the far wall, was a man. He was slumped on the floor, his head bowed, his dark hair falling over his face. He wore nothing but a pair of ragged trousers. His back was a crisscrossing tapestry of old and new scars, some faded to silver, others still raw and angry. Heavy, black iron manacles were clasped around his wrists, the chains leading to thick rings set deep in the stone wall. My breath caught in a strangled sob. Slowly, as if sensing my presence, he lifted his head. The torchlight fell across his face. It was the face from my dreams, younger than the king, leaner, but with the same strong jaw, the same proud shape of his bones, and his eyes. They were gold, warm, beautiful, honey gold, and they were filled with an agony so profound it cracked my soul in two. Lyra! His voice was a raw, broken whisper, a real voice, not a mental one, hoarse from disuse, from screaming. It was him, Aemon, the prince, my ghost, my hope. He was real, and he was a prisoner, chained in the darkness beneath his brother's throne. My breath died in my throat. The air in the dungeon was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and despair. It was a place where hope came to be buried, and in the center of it, the source of all my impossible dreams was chained to a wall. Aemon. The name was a prayer and a wound. The man who had spoken of stars and freedom was here, in the dark, bleeding and broken. The ghost who had held my sanity together was flesh and bone in agony. Lyra? He whispered again, his voice raw, scraping against the oppressive silence. The sound of my true name, spoken by his real voice, broke the spell of my shock. A sob, sharp and painful, tore from my chest. I took a step forward, my bare feet cold against the gritty stone, then another. I stopped just before the iron bars, my fingers gripping the cold, rusted metal. He was only a few feet away. I could see the sweat beading on his brow, the dark, matted state of his hair. I could see the way his chest hitched with every pained breath. This was real. The tower was the dream. This was the waking nightmare. He tried to push himself up, to sit straighter, but the movement sent a shudder of pain through his body. The chains that bound him groaned, a metallic sigh in the quiet dark. "You're real," I breathed, the words barely a whisper. My voice felt foreign, a rusty thing I hadn't used in years. A faint, broken smile touched his lips. It was the saddest, most beautiful thing I had ever seen, always have been. His golden eyes held mine, and in their depths I saw the same warmth, the same soul that had met me in the moonlit clearing. It was him, trapped, tortured, but it was him. Why? The question was all I had. Who did this? Even as I asked, I knew the answer. The terrible, impossible answer. His gaze flickered. "My brother," he said, his voice flat with a grief so old it had become a part of him. "The king. But you said he was protecting me," I stammered, my mind reeling, trying to fit the pieces of this monstrous puzzle together. The protector and the torturer. They were the same man. He is, Eamon rasped, a dry cough shaking his frame. He thinks he is. He pulled at time. His chains, a futile, desperate gesture. He is protecting you from me. My mind spun. None of this made sense. From you? You are my... I couldn't say the word. Mate. The word felt too sacred for this filthy place. I know, he whispered, his eyes closing for a moment in pain. He knows it too. That's the problem. I stared at the raw, chafed skin of his wrists beneath the heavy iron manacles, at the dark, bruised lines on his back. This wasn't protection. This was cruelty. This was the work of a monster. He is a monster, I said, my voice shaking with a sudden hot rage. No, Eamon said, his voice gaining a sliver of its dream world strength. He pulled himself forward, inch by painful inch, until he was closer to the bars. The torchlight illuminated the sharp planes of his face, the deep-set exhaustion in his eyes. He is a man bound by a curse, Lyra, one that has poisoned our bloodline for generations. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Every firstborn son of the Rook line is flawed. The wolf inside us is too strong, unpredictable. When our fated mate is near, the bond, it doesn't settle us. It drives us mad. It turns the wolf into a possessive, uncontrollable beast. Decades ago, our grandfather killed his own mate in a fit of jealous rage. Malin saw it. He was just a boy. The cold from the floor seeped into my bones. A curse. Not just a cruel brother, but a destiny soaked in blood. He swore an oath to our mother on her deathbed. Eamon continued, his voice dropping lower, a conspiratorial whisper that drew me in. He swore he would never take a mate, that he would never let the curse claim another innocent life. He locked his own wolf away, starved it, mastered it through sheer force of will. That scar on his face, he got it fighting his own beast for control. The image of the cold, unfeeling king flashed in my mind, the deadness in his golden eyes. It wasn't emptiness, it was a cage. He had caged himself. But what does that have to do with you? I asked, my fingers tightening on the bars. I am the second son. The curse skipped me. My wolf is whole, balanced. He looked at me, and the longing in his eyes was a physical force, pulling at the very center of my being. When fate chose you as my mate, and Ronan put you up for sale, Malin saw a chance to fulfill his oath and break the cycle forever. He would keep you for himself, a bride in name only. He would lock you away, keep us apart, and let the bond between us wither and die. He believes that by sacrificing my happiness, and yours, he is saving you from a fate he cannot bear to witness. His jailer, his brother. He was trying to be a savior, a twisted, broken, monstrous savior. He's wrong, I whispered. He's terrified, Eamon corrected softly. I looked at his chained hands, his bruised body. This was not the act of a terrified man. This was the act of a tyrant. But deep down, a part of me recognized the scent of fear that clung to the king's cold silence. I had to get closer. The space between the bars was just wide enough. I pressed my shoulder against the cold iron, and with a desperate stretch, I reached my hand into the cell. My fingers trembled in the air, inches from him. He looked at my hand as if it were the sun. With a grunt of effort, he dragged himself the last few inches. The chains scraped loudly against the stone. He lifted his own hand, the heavy manacle weighing it down, and our fingers touched. Fire. A bolt of pure, white-hot energy shot up my arm, straight to my heart. It wasn't a spark, it was a lightning strike. The world behind my eyes exploded into a cascade of images. A moonlit run through a forest, the taste of snow on my tongue, the feeling of his laughter, deep and free. A flash of his golden eyes, not in sorrow, but in joy. Feelings, memories, his and mine, suddenly tangled together. The bond, suppressed and starved for so long, roared to life, I gasped, snatching my hand back as if I'd been burned. He stared at me, his eyes wide, his breath coming in ragged pants. Did you feel that? I could only nod, my heart a wild thing in my chest. A strange warmth was spreading under my skin, starting from my fingertips. A feeling of rightness, of coming home. Suddenly, a sound from above. A heavy door slamming shut, the distant shout of a guard. Their work was done. They were coming back. Panic seized me. Eamon's eyes widened with fear not for himself, but for me. Go, he hissed, his voice urgent. Lyra, you have to go. Now. If he finds you here. He didn't need to finish. I knew. I scrambled back, my feet slipping on the slick stone. I cast one last look at him, at his beautiful, tortured face. The hope and the horror of it all crashed over me. I will come back, I whispered, a promise that was also a vow. Be careful, he urged, his voice already fading as I retreated into the dark passage. He watches everything. I ran. Up the winding stairs, my lungs burning, my mind screaming. I didn't stop until I was back in the familiar prison of my tower room. I pushed the heavy oak door shut, leaning against it, my body shaking uncontrollably. I listened. Footsteps echoed in the main hall below, but none came up the stairs. The castle settled back into its groaning silence. I was safe. I slid down the door to the floor, wrapping my arms around myself. But the chill was gone. A strange heat was pulsing through my veins, a low, steady thrum of power I had never felt before. I looked down at my hand, the one that had touched him, and I saw it. On the back of my wrist, just beneath the skin, a faint, silvery mark was beginning to glow, the shape of a crescent moon, entwined with a single, snarling wolf, the mark of a true mate, awakened, and it burned with a fire that would never be extinguished. The mark was a secret fire beneath my skin. It pulsed with a soft, silvery light, a constant, living reminder of the truth chained in the darkness below. During the day, it was a faint, shimmering tattoo that I kept hidden under the long sleeve of my dress, but at night, in the privacy of my tower room, it glowed. It was a beacon, a brand, a promise. It was Eamon's touch, made permanent. My dreams were different now. The connection was stronger, clearer. The moonlit clearing felt more real, the scent of pine and rain more potent. When I met him there, the sorrow in his eyes was still present, but it was now underscored by a fierce, burning hope. He knows. Eamon's voice echoed in my mind one night, the words laced with a new urgency. We sat on opposite sides of the crackling fire, the familiar distance between us now, an unbearable chasm. Mullen, he can't see the mark, but he can feel it. The bond. He can feel that you've been claimed. I thought of the king's visit, the way his cold, golden eyes had narrowed on me, searching for something he couldn't name. He had felt the shift, the awakening. What will he do? I asked, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. Eamon's mental gaze fell to the flames. He will try to break it, to break us. He's desperate, Lyra. He thinks he is fighting fate to save you. He doesn't understand he is fighting his own heart. The words hung in the dream space, heavy with a meaning I didn't want to comprehend. My visits to the dungeon became a dangerous ritual. I waited for the nights of the storm, for the moments when the guards were distracted. I learned the castle's rhythms, the shifting of the sentries, the groans of the old stones that signaled a change in the wind. I moved through the shadows like a ghost, a silent wraith on a desperate pilgrimage. Each time I saw him, it was a blessing and a torment. I would bring him scraps of bread and cheese stolen from my own meager meals, a small cup of water. He would devour them like a starving wolf, his gratitude a painful thing to witness. We would talk, in low, hoarse whispers through the iron bars. He told me of his childhood, of a time before the curse had fully claimed his brother. He spoke of a young, laughing Malin who taught him how to track, who carried him home on his shoulders when he was too tired to walk. He painted a picture of a man I couldn't recognize, a man who had been murdered and replaced by the cold, silent king. He locked his wolf away after our father died, Eamon whispered one night, his voice thick with old pain. He starved it, beat it into submission. The man you see now, he is only half a soul, a king ruling over a kingdom of his own grief. With every visit, the bond between us grew stronger. We never touched again, the risk was too great, but I could feel him, a constant, warm presence at the edge of my senses. The mark on my wrist would burn hotter when I was near him, a secret language only we understood, and the king felt it too. He started visiting my tower, not often, but with a new, unsettling regularity. He would appear at the door, a dark, silent shadow, and simply, watch me. He wouldn't speak. He would just stand there, his powerful form filling the room with a suffocating tension, his cold, golden eyes tracking my every move. It was an interrogation without words. He was searching for the source of the change he felt in me, the new strength in my spine, the faint spark of defiance in my eyes. One evening, He brought a book. He set it on the table by the hearth, the sound of the leather cover hitting the wood echoing in the silence. "You should read," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had spoken to me in weeks. "It will pass the time." He turned to leave, but I found my voice, that small, rusty thing, now strengthened by Eamon's love. "Why are you doing this?" He froze, his hand on the door. Slowly he turned back to me. His face was a mask of stone. But for a fraction of a second, I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of deep, profound pain, the same pain I saw in his brother's. "I am keeping a promise," he said, his voice rough. "By torturing an innocent man?" The words were out before I could stop them. They hung in the air between us, sharp and glittering and dangerous. His jaw tightened. The muscle there jumped. He took a step toward me, and then another. The air crackled with a sudden, violent energy. His scent, pine and ozone and something wild flooded my senses, overwhelming me. He stopped just before me, so close I had to crane my neck to look up at him. The sheer force of his presence was a physical blow. He was the Alpha King, a creature of absolute power, and I had just challenged him. "You know nothing of what is innocent," he growled, his voice a low, threatening vibration that I felt in my bones. His golden eyes, so like Eamon's, but so terrifyingly different, bored into me. They were a winter storm, cold and furious. He was looking for the truth. He was searching for the crack in my composure. And then his gaze dropped, down to my hands, which were clenched into fists at my sides. To my left wrist, which I had unconsciously turned inward to hide the mark. He saw the movement. His eyes narrowed. Before I could react, his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around my wrist like a manacle of iron. His grip was impossibly strong, his touch both ice-cold and burning hot. He forced my hand open, turning it over. He saw the mark, the soft silvery glow of the moon and the wolf. It flared under his touch, burning brightly against my skin, a defiant declaration of a bond he had tried to murder. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, guttural noise that was not human. It was the sound of a wolf's agony, the same tortured howl I had heard from the dungeons. But this time, it was coming from him. He stared at the mark, his face a canvas of disbelief, fury, and a terrifying, heartbreaking despair. The king's mask shattered, and for one horrifying moment, I saw the man beneath. The broken boy Eamon had spoken of. "No," he breathed, the word a ragged prayer. He looked from the mark on my wrist to my face, and his eyes, they were wild. The cold stillness was gone, replaced by a raging, golden inferno. The beast he had kept caged for so long was looking out at me through his eyes, and it was screaming. He released my wrist as if it had burned him, stumbling back a step. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a primal, uncontrollable power. I could feel his wolf, a raging tempest of possession and rage, clawing at the bars of his control. This was the curse. This was what he had been fighting. This was what he had chained his own brother to prevent. A madness born of a bond he was never meant to feel. He thought he was protecting me from Eamon. But the curse, it wasn't just for the firstborn's mate. It was for any mate. He had brought the one thing that could destroy him into the heart of his fortress. He had brought me, and the bond he was feeling was not for his brother's mate. It was for his own. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The universe had played a cruel, terrible trick. Fate hadn't just given me one mate. It had given me two. Two brothers. One chained in the dark, the other trapped in a prison of his own making, and the mark on my skin burned for them both. The king stared at me, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The battle for control was waging within him, a war I could feel in the very air around us. He was losing. "Get out!" he snarled, the words ripped from his throat. It wasn't a command to me. It was a command to himself. He turned and fled, slamming the heavy door behind him. I heard the bolt shoot home, not with its usual finality, but with a frantic, desperate scrape of metal on metal. He wasn't locking me in. He was locking himself out. I sank to my knees, my whole body trembling. I stared at the mark on my wrist, now glowing with a fierce, silver light. It was no longer just a symbol of hope. It was a brand of a shared, impossible destiny. A destiny that was about to tear this kingdom, and my heart, in two. The castle held its breath. After the king fled my room, A new kind of silence descended upon the fortress. It was a tense, waiting silence, coiled like a serpent. The air itself felt thin, stretched to its breaking point. I did not see Malin for days. The silent serving woman still brought my meals, but now she would not even lift her eyes from the floor. Fear was a palpable scent in the halls, a creeping mist that slid under my door. Something had broken in the king. I had seen it in his eyes. The bars of his internal cage had buckled, and the beast within was now rattling the foundations of his soul. My dreams became fragmented, fraught with anxiety. Eamon was a phantom of worry, his image flickering at the edges of the firelight. He's losing control. Eamon's voice echoed in my mind, laced with a fear that was not for himself, but for his brother. The bond. It's reacting to his proximity to you, Lyra. It's tearing him apart. He thinks it's the curse twisting his mind, making him feel a false claim over you. He doesn't understand the truth. What is the truth? I pleaded, staring at the faint, shimmering mark on my wrist. Why does it burn for him, too? Eamon's silence was a heavy weight. Our bloodline is old, and it is tangled. Some legends speak of twin souls, of a bond that does not choose one, but both. He sounded lost, reciting a myth he didn't fully believe. I don't know, Lyra. I only know that he is in agony, and a king in agony is a danger to everyone. He was right. The danger arrived on the 5th night. It wasn't the king who came. It was his beta, Kian. He unlocked the door without ceremony and stood in the doorway, his slate-gray eyes hard and unreadable. Behind him stood 2 guards, their faces grim. The king has made a decision, Kian said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The alliance with your stepfather's pack is no longer viable. You are to be returned. The words were stones dropped into a deep well. Returned. Sent back to Ronan. The man who had sold me, who would sell me again, this time to the Jarl of the Northern Wastes. A man who broke his pretty things. Malin wasn't just sending me away. He was sending me to my death. It was a punishment. For waking the bond. For making him feel. For showing him the cracks in his perfect cold control. No, I whispered, the word a puff of air. Kian's expression did not change. It is not a request. You will be escorted at dawn. He turned to leave, but something inside me, something that had been dormant and silent for my entire life, finally snapped. It was the howl I had heard from the dungeons, the king's tortured flight, Eamon's whispered fears. It was the burning mark on my wrist and the love for a prince in the dark. It all coalesced into a single, blazing point of rage. My wolf, the one I never had, the one I was told was a barren, empty space inside me, rose up, and for the first time in my life, I roared. It was not a human sound. It was a raw, guttural cry of pure, undiluted fury. It was the sound of a she-wolf protecting her mate, of a queen defending her territory. The sound ripped through the silence of the tower, echoed down the stone stairs, and shook the very air. Kian and the guards froze, their eyes widening in shock. They stared at me, at the small, silent Omega girl who had just unleashed the sound of an alpha. I didn't give them time to recover. I launched myself at them. I was not a fighter, but I was fueled by a desperation that made me fearless. I clawed at Kian's face, my nails seeking purchase. He grunted, shoving me back, but I had created the opening I needed. I dodged past the stunned guards and ran. I fled down the spiraling stairs, my bare feet flying over the cold stone. I could hear their shouts. Behind me, the heavy thud of their boots as they gave chase. But I knew where I was going. I was not running away. I was running too. I took the hidden service stairs, plunging into the damp, cold darkness beneath the castle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror and purpose. The path was familiar now, a sacred map carved into my memory. I burst into the dungeon passage just as the guard's footsteps began to clatter down the stone steps behind me. Eamon was on his feet, clinging to the bars of his cell, his golden eyes wide with alarm. He had heard my roar. He had felt my terror through the bond. "Lyra, what is it? What's happening?" he cried, his voice raw. "He's sending me away." I gasped, my lungs burning. "To Ronan. He's throwing me to the wolves." The look on Eamon's face was one of pure horror. At that moment, Kian and the guards appeared at the end of the passage, their swords drawn. "Seize her!" Kian commanded, his voice cold and hard. I backed away, pressing myself against the cold, damp wall beside Eamon's cell. There was nowhere to run. and then another presence filled the narrow passage. A wall of cold fury. King Malin stood at the top of the stairs, his form silhouetted against the torchlight from above. He descended slowly, each step a deliberate, heavy impact. He was not the fleeing, broken man from my tower room. This was the king, the Alpha, a creature of absolute, terrifying power. His golden eyes were not the dead, empty pools I knew. They were burning, a raging, molten gold. The beast was no longer in the cage. It was wearing the crown. He ignored Kian and the guards. He ignored his brother chained to the wall. His gaze was locked on me. It was a look of pure, primal possession. "You," he growled, the single word vibrating through the stone. "Will not leave." "You commanded it, my lord," Kian said, his voice laced with confusion. Malin's head snapped toward his beta, a snarl, twisting his lips. "I have changed my mind." He took another step, his focus returning to me. He was stalking me, his movements fluid, predatory. "You woke it. You woke it, and now you will stay and face it." He was talking about the bond, about the beast. He was going to punish me by keeping me here, by forcing me to witness the madness he believed I had unleashed. "You can't!" Eamon cried out from his cell, rattling the bars with a strength born of desperation. "Brother, don't do this. Let her go. If you care for her at all, let her go free." Malin laughed. It was a terrible sound, devoid of humor, full of broken glass and rage. "Care?" he snarled, never taking his eyes off me. "Care is the heart of the curse. It is the poison. She will stay. She will be my queen. And she will watch as this bond makes me into the monster our father was." He was embracing the curse, surrendering to the madness, and he was going to drag me down into it with him. He was only a few feet from me now. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the raw power coiling in his muscles. I was trapped between a chained prince and a mad king. "I won't let you," I whispered, lifting my chin. My own wolf, newly awakened and fierce, rose to meet his. I was not the same girl he had bought. I was not a silent, broken thing. I was the mate of the rook line, and I would not bow. I held up my wrist, the mark glowing with a defiant, silver fire in the gloom. "This mark," I said, my voice clear and strong, echoing in the small, damp space. "It is not a curse, it is a choice, and I do not choose you." I turned my back on the king, and I pressed my hand flat against the cold iron of Aemon's cell door. I poured everything I had into that touch. All my love, all my hope, all my defiance. The bond between me and Aemon erupted, a supernova of pure energy. The mark on my wrist blazed with a light so bright it bleached the dungeon of all shadows. Aemon cried out, not in pain, but in power. The silver light flowed from my hand, over the iron bars, and wrapped around the manacles on his wrists. There was a sound like shattering stone. The black iron manacles, symbols of his brother's fear, exploded into dust. The chains fell to the floor with a deafening clatter. Aemon was free. I turned back to face the king. His face was a mask of stunned disbelief. He stared at his freed brother, at the impossible power that had emanated from me, and then his gaze fell to the still blazing mark on my wrist. For the first time since I had met him, Malin Rook looked afraid, not of the beast inside him, but of me. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes. It covered the dark pines of the Blackwood territory in a blanket of pure white, muffling the world in a gentle peace. From the window of my tower room, no longer a prison, but now simply a room with a view, I watched the flakes drift down, each one a tiny, perfect star. 3 months since the night. In the dungeon, the night a captive Omega found her voice, a prince was freed, and a king was brought to his knees. The aftermath had been a quiet, tense storm. Aemon, free from his chains but weakened by his long ordeal, had emerged from the depths of the castle not as a vengeful prince, but as a leader. The guards, who had witnessed my impossible act of power, looked at me with a new awe and fear. They had seen the bond made manifest. They had seen fate choose its side. And Malin, he had simply shattered. Faced with the undeniable truth of my bond with his brother, and the strange, echoing connection he felt for me himself, the rigid control he had maintained for decades crumbled. He had not fought. He had not raged. He had withdrawn. He retreated to his chambers, locking the door, abdicating his throne not through decree, but through absence. He was a ghost in his own castle, wrestling with a beast he no longer understood. Kian, his loyalty torn, had ultimately chosen order over his broken king. He had yielded to Aemon's quiet authority. The transition of power was not one of blood and swords, but of heavy silence and reluctant acceptance. Aemon now stood beside me, his warmth a solid, comforting presence at my back. His arms slid around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. We watched the snow together. He was still lean, and the faint traces of scars still marked his back, but his eyes were clear. The deep, aching sorrow was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet joy. "He's leaving," Aemon murmured, his breath warm against my ear. My heart gave a small, painful clench. "When?" "At dawn." I leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. Malin. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, I had been the only one he would see. I would bring him his meals, leaving them outside his door. Sometimes, he would open it. He never spoke. He would just stand there, his golden eyes so like Aemon's, yet so different, filled with a maelstrom of confusion, regret, and a longing so profound it was a physical wound. He looked at me as if I were a puzzle he could never solve, the source of his pain, and yet, the only thing that seemed to quiet the storm inside him. The twin bond was a fragile, confusing thread between us, a whisper of what might have been in a different life, under a different moon. It wasn't love, not like the blazing sun of my bond with Aemon. It was an echo, a shared scar. Last week, he had finally spoken. He had requested to see me. He was standing by the window in his chambers, looking out at the same forest. "I cannot be king," he had said, his voice rough, unused. "The beast is quiet now, but it is not gone. It feels you. It feels him. To stay here is to live on the edge of a blade." He had turned to me, his face gaunt, the old scar, a pale line against his skin. "I am ceding the throne to Aemon, and I am going into the northern wastes, the place he had almost sent me to. Die. I will live as our ancestors did," he explained, seeing the question in my eyes. "As a lone wolf, I will find my own peace, or my own end, in the wild. It is the only way to honor the promise I made, to keep everyone safe. From me." It was not an act of cowardice, but one of immense, heartbreaking courage. He was finally choosing to heal himself, not by caging the wolf, but by learning to run with it, far from those he might harm. Now, on the morning of his departure, the castle was still. Aemon held me tighter. "Do you want to go down?" he asked softly. "To say goodbye?" I nodded, my throat tight. We walked down the stairs, hand in hand. He was not in his kingly attire, but in simple leather and furs. A single pack was slung over his shoulder. He stood at the great doors of the hall, Kian beside him. His face was calm. For the first time, the lines of torment were gone. He looked free. He saw us approaching. His gaze met Aemon's. There was no animosity, only a deep, complicated well of brotherhood and regret. He gave his brother a single, solemn nod. A silent transfer of a kingdom, a life, a future. Then, he looked at me. He stepped forward, stopping a few feet away. The air between us was heavy with all the things that would never be said. All the pain, the fear, the misunderstanding. "Raya," he said, using the name he had been given. He would never speak my true name. It wasn't his to know. "The price I paid for you, it was not for a bride. It was for my brother's happiness. I just didn't know it." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, leather-bound object. It was the book he had given me. I was wrong. To lock away knowledge, to lock away life, to lock away love. He held it out to me. I took it, my fingers brushing his. There was no spark, no fire, just the brief, cool touch of a man who was already becoming a memory. "Be happy," he whispered, his golden eyes holding mine for a last time. There was no madness in them, no coldness, just a quiet, sad peace. That is all I ever truly wanted. He turned, and without another word, he pushed open the great doors and walked out into the falling snow, never looking back. Kian followed, to escort him to the edge of the territory. The doors swung shut, and he was gone. Eamon's hand found mine, his fingers lacing through mine. The mark on my wrist gave a soft, warm pulse, a pulse of pure, undiluted love, of home. We stood there for a long time, in the great hall that had once been my place of judgment. The banners of the snarling black wolf still hung from the rafters, but they no longer seemed menacing. They were just symbols of a history, of a past that had been redeemed. "It's over," I whispered. "No," Eamon said, turning me to face him. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. His warm, honey-gold eyes, the eyes that had called to me in dreams and saved me in the dark, were shining. "It's just beginning." He leaned down and kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic energy or desperate relief. It was slow and deep and sure. It tasted of pine and winter air, and a love that had crossed realms to find its home. It was a promise of 1,000 sunrises, of a shared throne, of a pack that would be ruled not by fear, but by love. My silence had been bought, my freedom had been stolen, and my heart had been torn. But here, in his arms, I was no longer a captive. I was no longer an Omega. I was Lyra. I was the Alpha Queen. And the snow kept falling, washing the world clean. The moon had seen their scars long enough. Tonight she watched them heal.